Hello, my name is Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. In this episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy, I'll talk about freedom and oppression. I'll explore both negative and positive freedom in the context of critical social justice, activism, and psychotherapy. Critical social justice activism primarily addresses negative freedom, while psychotherapy primarily ought to address positive freedom. While negative and positive freedom are both important, I will argue that neglecting positive freedom in psychotherapy is to neglect its core purpose. Let's start by clarifying terms. Negative freedom is freedom from external constraints and the interference of others. This could include partners, friends, families, communities, cultures, or governments. Excessive and unnecessary interference, I would call oppression. What is excessive is a tricky question, but we'll get to that later. Positive freedom means freedom to be and do what one chooses. Even in the absence of external constraints, there are biological and internal psychological constraints that limit our ability to be and do what we might choose. My premise is that every individual that lives in a culture or society must contend with both external and internal constraints that are inherent and necessary. These may feel oppressive, but they are just realities that we must contend with. I will say more about this shortly. At the same time, we can and should strive for a maximum, optimal degree of freedom, both from external and internal oppression. In his book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, Thomas Sowell identifies and critiques the idea that all social inequalities should be rectified by ensuring that there are equal outcomes for all. He asserts that this fails to recognize that not all inequalities are due to injustice, nor can they all be eliminated. Top-down interventions undermine freedom, as engineering desired results requires coercion. I propose that in addition to cosmic justice, there is a parallel quest for cosmic freedom. This is an idealized absolute state of freedom that can only exist in a fantasy realm. To attain it would require destroying constraints that are necessary for individuals and societies to exist and function. Let me be clear again. This doesn't mean we shouldn't be on a quest for both justice and freedom. We most definitely should be. We should optimize both negative and positive freedom while not ignoring or seeking to destroy all inherent and necessary internal and external constraints. The bottom line for me is that there is a place for activism in the name of justice and freedom, but it matters how this is conceived and pursued. Critical social justice has its part to play, but the more cosmic it goes, whether in terms of justice or freedom, the more problematic it becomes. Now let's focus on positive freedom and ask, what are the internal forces that oppress us? A partial list of internal forces that limit our positive freedom include addictions, compulsive behaviors, intrusive thoughts, unproductive worry, obsessions, resentment, anxiety, depression, shame, fear, uncontrollable anger, limiting beliefs, and ignorance. That's just a start. There are many more. This is not to say that all of these things are simply generated internally. They are the product of a complex interaction with our environment, especially including other people. External factors play their part in these internal oppressive forces. To be an activist is to take responsibility for those oppressed externally. To engage in psychotherapy is to take responsibility for how we oppress ourselves. So how does psychotherapy facilitate greater degrees of positive freedom? To tackle this question, first I propose that there are 4 fundamental targets of therapy. These have become clear to me after decades of studying many different theories and modalities and integrating them into my practice. I remember an old interview with Bruce Lee, who had studied many different martial arts. The interviewer asked him which of the martial arts was his favorite. Lee looked at the interviewer sideways and gave his enigmatic grin. Then he said, and I paraphrase, that in the end he realized that he had 2 arms and 2 legs, and the point was to use them as effectively as possible. I'm not saying that I'm the Bruce Lee of psychotherapy, but I can identify the arms and legs of it. And as I will explain, understanding these core targets suggests how therapy facilitates positive freedom. It boils down to perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. In other words, we perceive an event, we have feelings about it, we have thoughts about it, and we act or respond based on our feelings and thoughts. Our actions produce results. Then we perceive those results, have feelings and thoughts about that, and take our next action. And round we go. That's the basic pattern, but it gets more complicated than that. We don't just think about events, we also think about our feelings connected to the event. We don't have feelings just about the event, we also have feelings about our thoughts related to the event. What we do is not a straight line from feelings to thoughts to behavior. The path from a perception to a behavior loops back on itself. And when we have taken some action, we don't just wait for the result so we can repeat the process. We have feelings and thoughts about what we have done after we do it and before the results unfold. With all of this going on, it's a wonder we aren't more paralyzed by confusion and indecision than we are. These 4 fundamental aspects of our day-to-day, moment-to-moment lives are where we experience internal oppression or potentially greater degrees of freedom. Let's dive deeper and consider perception. We don't just perceive what is there. We're selective. We notice some things and ignore everything else. This selection is programmed by our brains that evolved to detect through our senses what is relevant to our survival and well-being. Our perception is also driven by implicit unconscious beliefs that we have adopted based on our past experiences. We learn what is important to pay attention to. This serves us, but it can also oppress us. Our perceptual habits keep us alive, but they also screen out information that could expand our options and serve our liberation. Following on from perceptions, if not instantaneous with them, we have feelings. The feelings we have about our perceptions is also wired into our brains by evolution and past experiences. Our feelings exist to motivate our behavior in response to our perceptions. We may be conscious that we feel something, but are often unconscious about why. Sometimes we aren't even conscious of what we feel, yet our feelings still drive our behavior. This is a major and common cause of internal oppression. We are captured, and we don't even know it. In the gap between feeling and behaving, if there is one, we think. What we usually think of is a reason or a set of reasons that justify what we're already reflexively inclined to do. If we have any free will, it exists in this gap. That freedom depends on the nature of our thinking. It depends on self-reflection. This is where psychotherapy steps in. The therapist facilitates a self-reflective process for the client. Over many sessions, perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are examined and questions are explored. For instance, what have I screened out of my perceptions and what might explain my tendency to ignore certain things? What implicit unconscious beliefs underlie my emotional reaction and drive my behavior? What circumstances gave rise to these beliefs? How did these beliefs serve me once upon a time? Is this belief valid on this occasion? Why might it not be valid? What other plausible beliefs or explanations might I consider? Would an alternative belief evoke a different emotional response? If feelings serve the purpose of motivating behavior, what behaviors are implied by my feelings? What might be the result of acting from that belief and the feeling that it evokes? What effect or outcome do I intend to produce with my actions? Have I considered multiple possible outcomes? Why is one outcome more desirable than another? Do my feelings require action, or would refraining from action be wiser? Who am I? And who do I want to be? What values do I want my behavior to embody? By the way, we don't just think in words. All of these questions can also be explored and answered through linguistic metaphors and even through movement. This is just a sampling of the kinds of self-reflective inquiry that can happen in therapy. It's a place where perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and behavior are made an object of awareness and explored through dialogue. This is the first step toward meaningful positive freedom. It opens more options and leads to more conscious choices. This is the basis of positive freedom. Of course, such an inquiry requires a strong therapeutic alliance. The therapist must listen closely and deeply, have unconditional positive regard for the client, empathize with their pain, challenge them to engage in difficult material and questions, and allow the client to come to their own conclusions. A good therapist is mindful to not be an external oppressive force by providing answers. Suggestions can be made, but the freedom of the client to make their own meaning out of their experience should be protected. Certainly, the therapist should not try to indoctrinate the client with their own political ideology. That would be oppressive. This process can include exploring the possibility or likely consequences of the client's conclusions and actions, but in the end, the client's life is their own. Can they recognize the internal forces that unnecessarily constrain their freedom? Can the therapist help them to find the motivation to tolerate fear and discomfort, overcome these forces, risk new behaviors, and embrace greater freedom? By the way, freedom is a burden. This is well known. Not everyone is up for it. It's hard work, uncomfortable, and can usher in terrifying change. But if you sign up for therapy, whether you know it or not, to some degree, this is what you sign up for. While being supportive and encouraging, the therapist should respect the client's pace for cultivating degrees of positive freedom and not push too hard. I realize I'm merely describing the scaffolding of therapy, the abstract frame that it's built on. In practice, it is a rich and juicy and sometimes messy process that unfolds uniquely for each therapist and client. While providing a case study could help to illustrate this, I've decided that it would make the video too long. I invite you to reflect on your own experiences in therapy, whether as a therapist or a client. Or you could imagine how the process of therapy could facilitate greater positive freedom in this way. If you're liking this video so far, please go ahead and give it a like. And if you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe and click the bell for notifications for future videos. And leave me a comment. I'm curious about what you think and will respond to as many comments as I can. Feel free to disagree with me. I don't respond to insults. I just remove them. Okay, now let's deal with the philosophical question of free will. This is a long debated philosophical question that I would rather not get into, but I find it necessary, as it is the assumption that underlies the whole idea of positive freedom. First, let's consider the argument against free will. There are many inherent constraints to the idea of free will. For instance, when we examine perception, feeling, thinking, and behavior, we learn that each one functions according to processes out of our immediate awareness and control. We can study these things from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, from a psychological perspective, and from a social perspective. We can have elaborate understanding of how it all works. Whatever we come up with, it will include countless deterministic factors beyond our conscious will that facilitate and regulate every process we can identify. It can add up to the view that we are not free at all. We are inescapably oppressed by our own nature. To posit free will, we might imagine a homunculus somewhere in our brain, separate from all neurological machinery. This little man manipulates levers, switches, and buttons, obedient to our will. and our will exists in some metaphysical space separate from our deterministic brain and cognitive structures. We can imagine that, but it's ridiculous. I have another way to think about it. Bear with me. I propose that the question of free will versus predetermination contains two false assumptions. The first is that there is only one possible future. Once it has happened, theoretically, it is argued, every single event down to atoms can be seen as leading to that outcome. My objection to this is that it doesn't prove that that was the only possible outcome. Something else might have happened. With the extremely complex interaction of infinite systems all converging in the human brain, the universe seems to be made to be creative and produce novelty. The possibility for freedom is baked into the universe. In any case, I believe it is impossible to prove that everything that will happen could even hypothetically be predicted. That's the first fallacy. The next assumption, which I believe is also a fallacy, is that there is a self that is the locus of freedom. From this point of view, free will is exercised by the ego. Otherwise, we can't seem to make any sense of it. But what if the self is an emergent illusion that is simply the mega-complex synthesis of multiple processes that harness the potential for novel outcomes in a universe where the future is indeterminate? A useful illusion that gets us to participate. I don't mean to say that it all boils down to neurological processes. Our brains play a part, but so does consciousness. That monster question. It's been argued that consciousness doesn't simply emerge at the level of human brain. It's a fundamental dimension of all things. That view relies on a definition of consciousness as the ability to respond to stimuli. So, it is most primitive in atoms and most complex in brains. This suggests that our human consciousness is layered. We have more embodied and less self-reflective ways of responding to stimuli, and we also have conscious thought and language for mediating our responses to stimuli. So far, I've pointed to the role of thoughtful linguistic questioning as a way that psychotherapy facilitates greater positive freedom. But therapy can also facilitate more embodied explorations. These can also open up experiences of freedom. I don't have time to explore this here, but I feel it is important to acknowledge it. The most powerful therapy, in my opinion, gets these two modes of exploration working together. What if, instead of the illusion of a self, the universe has free will and exercises it through us? Maybe the ego is just the coordination of multiple cognitive processes that we experience subjectively as a self. I propose that our emergent capacity for self-reflection in terms of making perceptions, feeling, thinking, and behavior an object of our awareness and inquiring into them is our free will. Our self is simply our participation in the indeterminate nature of reality. As this is an evolved capacity, we can guess that it confers potential adaptive value. It can potentially serve life, including our own. If it does, it will persist. If it does not, it will cause its own demise. An important point here is that the freedom it makes available is not cosmic freedom. It is maximal freedom within the constraints of what serves life. By the way, I'm not the first one to think about free will in this way. American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett pointed in this direction in his book, Freedom Evolves, except the part about consciousness. Other philosophers such as Alfred North Whitehead, Henry Bergson, Francisco Varela, and Spinoza, and others have suggested similar things. As best as I understand it, my job as a therapist is to facilitate my clients' maximum positive freedom in the ways that I have described. Perceptions, feelings, thinking, and behavior all entail certain constraints. They are only possible within certain parameters. We could conclude that we therefore have no real free will and are cosmically oppressed. Or we could recognize degrees of freedom and overcome unnecessary forms of oppression. Or else, I could just junk all that and become a critical social justice activist therapist. I could help clients hone their perceptions so that they focus mostly on any instances of social injustice, microaggressions, and power differentials. I could fan the flames of outrage and resentment. I could provide an ideological system for interpreting all social interactions in terms of power and oppression. That mode of thinking could explain all failures, disappointments, and suffering as a product of victimization. I could recruit clients as activists against external oppression in service to negative freedom. Or not. For a movement that proclaims its emancipatory intent, it fails at finding and cultivating real freedom. As one tool in a full toolbox, it has its uses, but as a hammer, it demands that everything is a nail. It winds up pounding in the nails of its own coffin. Self-reflection and open inquiry are hobbled by its dogmatic ideological positions. It provides all-encompassing answers to limited and leading questions. It forbids inquiry into anything that might produce evidence contrary to its own foregone conclusions. It rejects alternative interpretations of whatever evidence it does have. It tosses out tools that might facilitate greater degrees of freedom and demands that everyone get into its cage because it has hung a sign over it saying freedom. Okay, having had my little rant, let me reiterate. There is an important place and need for social activism. It serves negative freedom by overcoming external forms of oppression. When its guiding vision is cosmic justice and cosmic freedom, its utopian agenda disregards the inherent biological, psychological, and social constraints that make life possible. If it can push for greater degrees of negative freedom, mindful of those parameters, then it is a great force for good. However, even then, without attending to positive freedom, negative freedom can accomplish only so much. Overcoming external forms of oppression leaves us to be internally oppressed and barely able to make use of our negative freedom. Conversely, positive freedom without negative freedom is equally compromised. We need both forms of freedom. We need social activism, and we need self-reflective inquiry or introspection. Psychotherapy isn't the only way to do this, but it is one important way. Turning it into activism driven by the aim of overcoming external oppression is a mistake. It's not that activism is wrong, it's just the wrong tool for the job. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope that this made sense and gave you an additional way to think about activism, therapy, freedom, and oppression. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. May you enjoy maximum and optimal degrees of negative and positive freedom. Bye for now.